Hello, and welcome to the Expanse. I'm Mitch the Quack, and I hope you're having a less quack day than myself. Today we're going to be talking about Ice Crown Citadel, the home of the Lich King, because I think Ice Crown Citadel, and in turn Ice Crown, was a part of Ulduar. And by the end of this theory, I'll hopefully be able to prove it and explain why it may be important to the future of BFA and World of Warcraft as a whole. I've been working on this theory for a while, and I guarantee if you manage to get to the end of this one, you'll walk away shocked, but enlightened. So to begin, let's start with the basics. The general assumption about the size of Ulduar is it stretches from Mimron's workshop, at the back of the raid, all the way to the Storm Peaks. There are also the missing halls of Valor that were once a part of the facility and are now missing. These factors alone make the facility big, however I think Ulduar is bigger. Why? Well, the boundaries of Ulduar are generally assumed, and the assumption was the boundaries stopped at Zul'Drak and Ice Crown. The reason being, these two locations at the time and for the longest time have had little to no evidence proving they would have been a part of a Titan facility. That was, until BFA, Zandalar and Ulduar. Zandalar fully confirms trolls can, and have, occupied and redesigned Titan facilities in a similar way to the Night Elves. Here's the interesting thing though, Atal'Dazar and King's Rest, like the Seals of Ulduar, are most likely a part of the Ulduar facility. The reason this is important is because Zul specifically uses the center of Atal'Dazar to kill Razam. And this is not the first time we've seen something like this happen to a lower like Razan. The lower of Rhinos in Zul'Drak, Akali, suffers an identical fate to Razan, including the fact both were killed by the same magic and in the same fashion. The implication here is Zul'Drak is a bigger version of Atal'Dazar. Both are quite apparently subsections of bigger facilities, Ulduar and Ulduar respectively, and both were quite obviously designed to experiment on, and assumably hold, lower. This should really make you think about those quote-unquote shrines in Zul'Drak, and whether they were actually designed to be shrines in the first place. But I digress. The main point here is, thanks to BFA, there is an ample amount of evidence to support Zul'Drak being part of Ulduar. This revelation basically expands Ulduar's size to the southeastern edge of the Howling Fjord, and explains why there are massive Titan ruins, Troll ruins, Vrykul, Furbog, Earthen, and Giants littered around the fjord, and the Grizzly Hills. The creatures were most likely protecting Ulduar's outermost perimeter, while the ruins were probably the outermost edge of the facility. This expansion raises one very glaring question. Why isn't ICC a part of Ulduar? Or more precisely, why hasn't it been considered that ICC was once a part of Ulduar? I mean, the zone is literally sandwiched between zones that have been substantially influenced by the Titans. Specifically, Shalazar Basin, Winter's Grasp, and the Storm Peaks. And that's not mentioning the fact the Chamber of Communication, which we use to talk to Azeroth in Legion, and the Vault of Archivon, a Titan Vault, share a mountain with ICC, and assumedly, up until this point, non-Titan building. It's a scenario which is pretty unlikely considering how thoroughly the Keepers built into mountains. I mean, just look at the Storm Peaks. The chances of ICC being a part of Ulduar seem higher than the chances of it not. And if you're curious as to why I've been excluding the Borean Tundra and Dragonblight, it's because they're both fundamentally on the low ground. The curve of the land that goes from Shalazar Basin and Winter's Grasp to the Howling Fjord is mountainous and elevated in comparison to the sea. Shalazar is pretty much the only exception here, and even then, it's a basin with a mountain range higher than the sea and the lowland around it. Basically, it seems as if Ulduar was built into the mountains of Northrend. Like, all of them. And the Keepers avoided building on the low ground when it came to Ulduar. And before I hear the cries of what about Wimrest? Ulduar, well actually TOT did this first, but few people pay attention to MOP lore, so Ulduar. Ulduar solidified a very important fact about the Keepers. That fact is, the Keepers are horrible at disposing of their failed creations. The Fair Devourer didn't come out of nowhere, and I highly doubt Galakrond was the first attempt at creating a dragon. Either way, considering Dragonblight's location, at the base of a Titan facility, with the Bioresearch Division adjacent in one zone and a weapons testing facility in another, it's almost a certainty Dragonblight was quite literally a biohazardous landfill of failed Titan creations, which also, but not precluded to, dragons. Also, the reason why I haven't mentioned Crystal's Song is because that zone seems to be the odd one out. As in, you'd assume with the heavy concentration of ley lines and the elven ruins in the area, there would be some obvious reason for what the Keepers could have been using the area for. Yet, from the design of the Storm Peaks, it seems as if water flowed into the valley, putting that entire area underwater. At this point, I've hopefully at least raised your awareness of why ICC and Ice Crown could have been a part of Ulduar. It's very apparent considering their location that there should be some relation. From here, we're going to move on to the zone of Ice Crown itself, because if this theory is correct, there should be some proof of Titan influence in the area. And there is. But before we get to that, there's something I need to make abundantly clear about the zone of Ice Crown. The Ice Crown we see in game is not what Ice Crown originally looked like. Only after Illidan's first attempt to destroy the Lich King did Ice Crown begin to look the way it does in game. Prior to Illidan summoning a storm very similar to the one the Naga wanted to summon in the Crucible storms, Ice Crown was basically a massive glacier. And when I say massive, I mean massive. As in, basically imagine a glacier that was as tall as Ice Crown Citadel, possibly bigger, and as wide as the zone of Ice Crown. That is how big the Ice Crown Glacier was. And to be clear, ICC has never moved. The Citadel was built before the glacier was destroyed, meaning the Citadel was built within the ice. And the reason I'm so certain of this is that I'm not overreacting when I say the storm Illidan used was as powerful, if not more powerful, than the storm we stopped Unut & Co from summoning in 8.15. The scary thing though is the Lich King's prison and the Ice Crown Glacier was so strong Illidan had to pummel the glacier with the storm just to expose and wound the Lich King. The main point here though is all of Ice Crown prior to its attack was technically underground. And this is where the first bit of Titan influence becomes apparent, because the ramparts of Ice Crown make no sense. Or, more precisely, to me, the ramparts of Ice Crown don't make sense as ramparts. And I don't say that lightly, as I do think Blizzard designed its maps very well. I mean, yes, Mordrethar, Corporathar and Uldrathar make walking into Ice Crown difficult, but walking an army through Ice Crown to begin with is tactically insane, considering walking an army through the base of a canyon is basically screaming "please ambush me." And that's not mentioning the fact certain ramparts are quite apparently useless or just out of place. Fundamentally, Ice Crown's defenses made no sense. That was until I realized Ice Crown was initially underground, meaning there was no need for these ramparts. And if these apparent ramparts weren't designed to be ramparts, what were they originally designed for? With this thought in mind, something you generally shrug off about the defenses of Ice Crown and ICC itself become very apparent. The ramparts don't only make no sense because of their positioning, they also make no sense because of their size. The ramparts are too big. They're not designed to hold mortals. They're designed to carry giants. They're designed to carry Titanforged. To explain that statement a little further, think about it like this. The Nerubians and the Nathrezim had a hand in sculpting ICC. The assumption's always been they actually built the Citadel and the surrounding defenses. There's just one problem with that. Both species build to their own needs. Take the necropolises the Scourge use. They are basically floating Nerubian Ziggurnauts. They're designed to hold the Rubians, not giants. The only exception to that rule is Naxxramas. However, Icarus and all the other Ziggurnauts are designed for mortals. As for the Nathrezim, you could have quite easily convinced me they constructed Ice Crown's defenses if the buildings weren't so far underground. The Nathrezim don't do underground. I mean, hell, they barely do buildings. Nathraz was basically a desolate rock with backed spires. The Nathrezim build with their wings in mind, so the ramparts of Ice Crown and their size don't fit their architecture either. This leaves one credible possibility behind the design of ICC, and if this was any other location in Azeroth, I'm almost certain this would have already been agreed upon, especially with the fact Ice Crown was initially underground. The Rathars and ICC were originally built by the Titans and redesigned by the Nerubians and the Nathrezim. And before I hear someone say, but it's stated they built ICC, the Elves built the Temple of Elune on the Broken Shore. Turns out that was a Titan facility. The Zandalari built their empire from nothing, but obviously used Titan infrastructure for Desire Lore. This list goes on, but I think I've got my point across. Built in WoW is no guarantee of original design. And honestly, of all the species that would be qualified to redesign a Titan facility, is it really that hard to imagine the Nerubians or the Nathrezim find the effort easy? I mean, with the Nathrezim alone, just look at the redesign of Antorus. Anyway, ICC and the ramparts of Icecrown seem to be designed for the Titan Forged. This part of the theory is strengthened by one recurring Titan design and 3 major locations within Icecrown, specifically the Shadow Vault, Jotunheim, and Ymirheim. How? Well, the Titan design I'm referring to is the spire design of the Temple of the Earth located in Deepholm. When first introduced, the Temple of the Earth's design was fairly unique. No other Titan facility really matched it, and we had just walked through the halls of Ulduar in Wrath. On top of this, its purpose was also quite unique. The Temple of the Earth was designed to hold the World Pillar, a Titan-made stone that bore the weight of all elemental and magnetic force in Deepholm. If the World Pillar was removed, Azeroth would have fallen into the elemental plane, fusing the physical plane and the elemental, and causing untold havoc in the process. Keep that point in mind for later, and the fact you can see the circle of stars right above the temple. This spire design didn't turn up again until WoD, and unless you were looking for it, you probably would never have noticed it. Bladefire Citadel in Frostfire Ridge is a version of the Temple of the Earth. It was created by the ogres who are ancestors of Titan creations, and so it's highly likely it's a form of Titan design in some way. With Bladespire, pay attention to the name and the fact it's located in a frozen wasteland. The next time this spire design appears is in a place that it really shouldn't have. The Temple of Elune on the Broken Shore was once a Titan facility redesigned by the Night Elves. This temple fits the same Titan spire design with an elven twist. Take note that this time, however, the spire sits aligned with a ley line that the Legion was able to use to invade Azeroth. We needed the Pillars of Creation to access the main Titan elevator, and the features of the main area within the Tomb of Sargeras. Do they happen to remind you of anything? I'd also like to add now, during the last mission of the Scourge campaign in Warcraft 3, Arthas has to unlock 4 obelisks to access the main area of the Frozen Throne, an almost identical feat we have to mimic with the Pillars of Creation to access the deeper areas within the Temple of Elune. I'd like to thank Skinnyfatperson from the Shinies and Lucydos Discord for pointing out the Warcraft 3 mission to me. Now, have you realised the similarities yet? If yes, I know. If not, here you go. ICC and the Temple of Elune are the same Titan spire design. One was reworked by the Night Elves, the other by the forces of the Lich King, yet fundamentally they both have a similar design. They are both tweaked just enough so that unless you're looking for the similarities, you wouldn't notice them. This recurring Titan spire design reinforces ICC being a form of Titan facility because it wouldn't have been the first or the last. ICC is not the only Titan spire to have been heavily redesigned, and it's not the only one to have had a powerful entity that's not a Titan Forge occupy its halls. Entities that just happen to relate to death. In reality, the real question from here becomes how many other similarities does ICC share with these other spires? Is it connected to a ley line? Does it contain something akin to the World Pillar? Is there something like the Circle of Stars above it? I believe ICC has little connection to all of these possibilities, but I'll get to those answers later. Continuing on to the areas within Icecrown that imply a connection to the Titans, the Shadow Vault is the most coincidental, and the Y is in the name, Shadow Vault. 9 times out of 10 when we hear the word vault related to a location, that place in some way, shape or form normally relates to the Titans. What would have been in this vault is uncertain, however if I was to guess, I'd assume the secrets of how Death Knight's rune forged came from the Shadow Vault, as in it's likely the rune magic was created by the Titan Forged and was rarely used or locked away for being too dangerous, hence the rune forge in the vault. Jotunheim strengthens the idea Icecrown was related to the Titans for a more complex reason than you'd think, because okay, it's a Vrykul settlement, but that could have been built at any point in time. The reason we know Jotunheim is old is because of the Vrykul in stasis located in the area. There are only 2 known instances in which Vrykul have been put into proper stasis. The first were the Winterscorn, who were put into stasis by the dragons as Tyr and Co fled south. The second were the Dragonflayers, who were trying to stave off the Curse of Flesh. Both of these events happened before recorded time in Azeroth, as in Ice Crown would have still been a glacier. But here's the kicker. The Titan Forged can't just go into stasis. They require a Titan facility to do so. The Keepers had to build a vault for the Trogs, while the Earthen and the Gnomes had to use Alderman so they could go into stasis. The implication is Jotunheim was, or still is, a part of a Titan complex that had the ability to put Titan Forged into stasis. This leaves Ymirheim, which, similar to the Shower Vault, is kind of coincidental. Ymirheim is apparently one of the most important places to Ulduar in Northrend, and once again, 9 times out of 10, when the ancestors of a Titan Forged species say a place is important for whatever cultural reason, it usually implies Titans, Old Gods, or both. The Dwarves are drawn to Titan ruins, hence a fascination with archaeology. The Mogu innately protected the Vale of Eternal Blossoms. This is another list that goes on, but I figure I've made my point. For Ymirheim to be important, the why probably relates to the Old Gods or the Titans, further strengthening the possibility of ICC and Ice Crown being related to the Titan facility of Ulduar. The last thing about Ice Crown that indicates the Titans had a heavy presence in the area is the fact that there are Nerubian ruins under Ice Crown, specifically ICC. The reason this is important is twofold. Servants of the Black Empire had a habit of building temple cities near, if not throughout, the Old Gods' bodies. The Akia were Black Empire servants. The Nerubians are a variation of the Akia. So it's quite likely they didn't build an Ice Crown by accident, even if they wanted to be free. On top of this, the Keepers had this habit of building near, or just reusing Black Empire structures to imprison the Old Gods. Just look at Anchorage. With this logic in mind, I doubt Anchorage and Anchorhet, the Old Kingdom, an older part of Ashel Narub, have the same prefix for shits and gigs. Arn is most likely a designation used by the Akia to describe temple cities that were quite literally built into, or close to, the Old Gods, if not at the very least being important cities. The fact Anchorhet / Ashel Narub runs all the way from the bottom of Winter's Grasp to the Argent Tournament grounds heavily implies the ruins under Ice Crown were most likely reused by the Keepers in some fashion, as the city is too close to Ulduar for it not to have been noticed by the Keepers. Further evidence to support this is the Nerubians' use of Obsidian Destroyers. The Nerubians corrupted and used Obsidian Destroyers when they first moved to northern Azeroth. As the story goes, the Drakari destroyed the Obsidian Destroyers so they could take a hold of the surface. So, the question becomes, why are the Scourge able to use Obsidian Destroyers in Warcraft 3? I also just want to thank Shirvu from Shinies and Lucydos for pointing that fact out to me. And yes, during Warcraft 3, the Scourge could spawn in Obsidian Destroyers, creatures that have been confirmed to be a form of Titan Forged. So, how did they obtain more? The answer is surprisingly simple. There were most likely more Obsidian Destroyers in Anchorhet. We know, thanks to the Island Expeditions in BFA, there are subterranean versions of the Tol'vir. It wouldn't be surprising if similar subterranean Tol'vir with Obsidian Destroyers were used to guard Anchorhet, especially when you consider they were originally created in the Forge of Wills within Ulduar. However, it's also possible the Nerubians could have, or still have, a working forge similar to the newly discovered Tol'vir. This specific speculation implies a lot, and also raises two important questions that tie into this entire theory. The first being, did we miss something important in Ice Crown? I mean, it has the equivalent of Anchorage running beneath it. So, could Ice Crown have been the uppermost reaches of the subterranean Anchorhet? Quite possibly. And if this is correct, did Yogg have an important piece of his body in these upper reaches of Anchorhet, similar to Sea Thun and Anchorage? With those questions, we've reached the why of this theory. At this point, I've hopefully proven ICC and Ice Crown in some way, shape or form should have been a part of Ulduar, as there appears to be way too many geographical markers to prove the point. With this said, the question becomes, why? Why is Ice Crown and ICC important? What is it about this area of the world that saw Yogg-Saron take interest in it, and the Titans build a facility over it? With these type of theories, there should always be a why. My answer to the why is simply death. However, before you roll your eyes, I'm not referring to the Lich King's presence. I think death has had a very strong presence in Ice Crown long before the Lich King, and it's been something the Titans and the Old Gods have been trying to keep in check for quite some time. So, to start this why off, we need to consolidate some information. The first bit of information we need to pay attention to is the Void's response to death in the Three Sisters comic. I know this point has been beaten over the head with a stick by many, including myself, but bear with me. Death and the Shadow do not get along. This was hinted at back in Wrath with the hostilities between the Lich King and Yogg-Saron, but that aggression could have been chalked up to personalities. The Three Sisters comic makes it very clear the cosmic force of Shadow does not like the cosmic force of Death. The second bit of information we need to draw attention to is the Titans' need to control Death. This has been hinted at through expansions since Vanilla, but it's all really come to the forefront in BFA. The Keepers, in some way, shape or form, had to micromanage Death to ensure they could reclaim Titanforged souls, and in some way, terraform Azeroth. With these two bits of information, a cascade of potent questions begins to flow. The first and foremost is, if the Void isn't friends with Death, and the Titans have to control Death to purge Azeroth of the corruption she faces, does that mean the Old Gods had to influence Death to ensure her corruption? I think the answer is yes. All cosmic forces in some way, shape or form seem to deny Death. The methods used are different depending on the group, but rarely does a spirit truly die. Rarely does any spirit experience true death. In the Old Gods' case, a spirit is either corrupted or consumed, becoming a part of the Void or a servant to it. So, similar to the Titans, the Old Gods in some way had to have been controlling where the spirits of the dead went. This is where Yogg-Saron comes into play. Because of all the lines and titles he touts, the one that sticks out the most is "Bow down before the God of Death." To our knowledge, all the Old Gods held titles that made them distinct. Shiraj, God of Seven Heads, N'Zoth, God of the Depths, C'Thun, unknown but probably something to do with Chaos, and Yogg-Saron, the God of Death. However, as I just pointed out, all cosmic deities, including the Old Gods, deny death. So the implication here is Yogg-Saron has some other connection to death that makes him distinct and worthy of his title. For the longest time, this point stumped me. That was until 8.1 and the reveal that Ice Crown, the zone itself, is an anchor that holds this world to the next. So Ice Crown's defining feature isn't the possibility of Old God influence, or the arrival of the Lich King, but instead the influence of death, possibly dating back as far as prehistory, as Bwonsamdi is old, as in possibly older than Azeroth old. The reason this reveal is so important is because it ties together Yogg-Saron's title, God of Death, the Lich King's title, Jail of the Damned, and the infamous line, "There must always be a Lich King." How? Well, we know the Old Gods siphon and corrupt other magics. Best example of this is the Emerald Nightmare and Life magic. What we also know is these magics can and do fight back. Just think about every adventure we've had in the Emerald Dream. On top of this, it just happens death and life magic share a spectrum of magic, and are innately similar. So, here's what I propose. The Old Gods during the Black Empire tried to corrupt death similar to how they corrupted life. Yogg-Saron was the Old God that made the attempt. I don't think he was able to corrupt death, because it's more dangerous and deadly than most magics, but what I think he was able to do was use the ley lines to connect to some form of true death, and siphon death's power. The eventual result would be the Black Empire in Ice Crown, as in some form of Anchor Het. This would explain Yogg's God of Death title, and the fact Saronite has unique properties. No other Old God's blood has the properties of Saronite. The stuff is near indestructible, and seems to only be vulnerable to itself, or a massive amount of light magic. If I was to guess, the reason Yogg's blood turned out the way it did is because he figured out a way to fuse death magic into his blood, creating a mineral that has the properties of the void and death. A mineral he could control without the fear of death pushing back. Think of something akin to the Drust in how they use death magic but don't necessarily have to deal with the undead. I mean, I don't think it's a coincidence Yogg was kept fairly separate from the undead and the Scourge, but still apparently had a relation to death. not mentioning the similar colouring of new and specific death magic animations and Sauronite. This brings us to Yogg-Saron's downfall. After the Well of Eternity, there is no way the Keepers weren't aware the old gods were siphoning from the ley lines, and it's almost a guarantee they figured out what type of magic Yogg was attached to. So, if I'm a Keeper and I've just defeated a creature siphoning pure death, and I know if I start to clear the corpse, I have a chance of killing the planet, and letting loose a force that scares every other cosmic force in existence, I'm left with the question, do I take the risk, or do I use the natural plug-in filter the old gods provided for me to contain the problem? I mean, what would you do? I think the Titans took the plug-in filter option. I think they left most of Yogg's body intact, hence why we can find what looks to be a piece of an old god in the Weeping Quarry with an Ice Crown. Yogg wasn't joking when he said, "The shadow of my corpse will choke this land for all eternity." For this plan to work though, and ensure Yogg didn't reclaim his power, I think the Keepers removed something of importance from Ymirheim. Whether it be the brain we fight in Ulduar, or something else, I'm unsure. But the location of Ymirheim would have been one of the highest places in Ahn'kahet during its prime. And this extraction would explain why the Sauronite mine in Ymirheim is the only place that bleeds Sauronite to this day. The wound from removing whatever organ was there never truly healed. Following this extraction, I think the Keepers installed the original Titan version of ICC into Yogg's body, specifically over the ley line Yogg was attached to, and had ICC act in a similar way to the Temple of Earth in Deepholm. The aim being to contain, mitigate and hold the spread of death magic from the source, using that massive pillar of haunted ice running through ICC as a world pillar equivalent. Then, for good measure, if the Keepers hadn't already, capped the Citadel in an egregious amount of ice to reinforce what was already there. I mean, I doubt Kil'jaeden encased the Lich King in ice for no reason, and I doubt the Keepers had a glacier the size of Ice Crown, part of Ulduar, for no reason. The Golden Wow, similar to the real world in certain circumstances, seems to slow the spread of death and decay. All in all, this specific point of the theory is how I think Ice Crown got its name, as in the ice is literally a crown placed over an old god's body. The final part of this plan, and the part I think was the most important, revolved around keeping the brain of Yogg alive and connected to Ice Crown, while also keeping him imprisoned. Why? Well, there must always be a Lich King, and where I know that line is the most contentious line to come out of Wrath, in BFA I think the line got validated. When Lady Waycrest dies, Gorak Tul is unleashed, and he makes it very clear that the corruption of death magic and her death allowed his return. The Titans couldn't kill Yogg just because of Azeroth. They also had to keep his sentience connected to Ice Crown, because if they didn't, death would have been unleashed upon the world. As Gorak Tul states, death is an inevitable force that stalks us at every turn. Death is not stagnant. ICC and the Ice Crown Glacier would have only done so much. There always needs to be a mind suppressing the death within ICC. Yogg was the original suppressor, the god of death, the original jailer of the damned, who siphoned death itself. When the Lich King arrived, he stole Yogg's people, stole the old god's blood, literally built an army off the old god's back, but only inherited the burden of death after Yogg's defeat at our hands. The title of Jailer of the Damned was only given to the Lich King at the end of Wrath, a title that when thought about made little sense. Frostmourne was where the Lich King kept most of the souls he killed, and most were freed with his death. The Scourge going out of control after his defeat makes no sense, unless there's another force pushing for freedom and control of the undead. But as recent lore heavily indicates, the old gods and the Void have minimal want to control the undead. They are apparently the enemy of all. I believe the force that wants to be free and in control is death and the damned, as the absence of the jailer would allow those damned, those truly damned to death, to escape. And what's scary about this theory is if it's correct, then even if the Ghost of Tyrannus was an old god illusion, the old god didn't lie. The Void does not want death to be free, and if the jailer goes, no matter who they are, everything's in trouble. So, why did the Titans build a facility in Ice Crown? The Titans needed a way to hold death at bay, which they did manage to do. but in the process had to use the mind and corpse of an old god to do so. Even after Loken's betrayal, the facility remained intact. Not even Yogg, who was being siphoned at this point, upset the facility, knowing what could be unleashed. Then the Lich King came. He remodeled the facility, practically usurped Yogg's power, and used death to spread his influence across the world. When we mortals defeated Yogg-Saron, true death nearly ran rampant. However, because of the Lich King and that one piece of Arthas that remained, that one piece that wanted to be king of something, the Lich King took on the burden of jailer. Then, if Bulvar, who I think picked up on what was going on during his torture, didn't accept the role of jailer, Azeroth would have already faced an army of true death that would have made the Scourge look tame. Now, if this theory is accurate, how could Ice Crown and ICC relate to BFA and the future of World of Warcraft as a whole? Well, first I just need to get a bit of preamble out of the way. If you've watched the content that should have links in the top corner right now, then you already know where I'm going with this, and if not, here's the abridged version. N'Zoth is trying to outscheme True Death and take Azeroth before it arrives. If the Eternal Palace cinematic is anything to go by, N'Zoth is not winning, and by the end of BFA, N'Zoth and us may lose Azeroth. Sylvanas will be the cause of this loss because whether she knows it or not, all her actions have benefited True Death in some form. I am also under the impression True Death made Sylvanas Warchief, and plans to cause an event similar to what would have happened with Deepholm had we not restored the World Pillar, as in causing Azeroth to fall into another realm, specifically the Shadowlands or another realm of death. What I left out of those videos was the why and the how, which I'll explain now as they incorporate this theory. If you haven't already guessed, I'm under the assumption the Damned, the Lich King's charges, represent death, and the Lich King is their warden. I also think the Damned set Sylvanas on the path to eventually free them, by making her war chief and by playing on her personality as well as her well-known obsession of wanting to master death. The reason they did this is twofold. They are avatars of True Death, and wish the end of everything. How are the Damned going to achieve this? Well, as N'Zoth whispered, his crown will open the way, which as you can probably tell by now, I think is ICC. I think the Damned are banking on Sylvanas going after ICC in her pursuit of mastering death, and in turn expected to knowingly or unknowingly release them, which I think she'll do by either using the Black Blade of the Empire, or Azerite to drain or just outright destroy Ice Crown Citadel, which I have hopefully made clear at this point is acting as a support beam stopping Azeroth from toppling into the realm of death. Either way, if Sylvanas succeeds in capturing and mastering death, she'll attack Stormwind or Thunderbluff, and we'll probably stop her, possibly kill her, but in the process of that act, we'll unleash True Death into the universe, causing Azeroth to fall anyway. And if Sylvanas fails and is consumed by death, becoming one of the few who are truly damned to death, we'll see the same outcome. Death will be unleashed. It'll just happen a lot faster. The only things standing in Sylvanas' way at this point seem to be the Jailer of the Damned, the Lich King, and quite possibly, if only out of desperation, N'Zoth. I think we are going to lose BFA, but we are going to lose it to death, and the fall of ICC will be the cause. Also, if you're curious, no, I don't think the title of the Damned is just referencing Death Knights and some really screwed spirits. I think it's also referencing something else, something spawned of true death, and I actually think we may have seen what the Damned look like and have an idea of where they fit into everything from, well, I guess vanilla to BFA. But that's content for another day. I still have to iron out a few theories about the cosmology before I finish that theory. So, thank you for watching, and until next time. Also, fun fact, the variations of this theory revolve around Yogg-Saron making a grand return, or Kel'Thuzad making a grand return.